The Blacksmith's Daughter, a short story written by Laurie. The air in the forge was a tangible thing, a heavy cloak woven from coal smoke and the metallic tang of hot iron. For Eliana, it was the breath of home. 12 years had passed since she'd first stood beside her father's anvil, a child barely tall enough to peer over its sturdy surface. The rhythmic clang of the hammer was the soundtrack to her days, a powerful pulse that echoed the growing strength in her own young arms. At 22, Eliana moved with a practiced grace, each swing of the hammer precise, shaping the stubborn metal with a skill that bellied her youth. Eliana straightened, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of her soot-stained hand. But in their small, tradition-bound village, her strength was not admired. She was of marrying age, yet the young menfolk kept a respectful, almost fearful distance. They'd cast sidelong glances, muttering about her calloused hands and the unwavering steadiness of her gaze. They desired wives who were dainty and delicate, not women who could outhammer them at the forge. Unwomanly, they sneered, and refused to purchase even a simple nail if Eliana had a hand in its making. Her father, a man whose own hands bore the marks of countless hours over the forge fire, never shared their narrow views. He'd taught her everything he knew, his calloused hand often covering hers as they worked the hot metal. Their bond, forged in the same intense heat that tempered their steel, had deepened after the quiet sorrow of her mother's passing. They were a small, self-sufficient unit, their lives intertwined with the rhythm of the forge. Then came the laughter, a sharp, ugly ripple that cut through the usual market clamor. Eliana, her brow furrowed in concentration as she meticulously shaped a delicate hinge, felt a knot of unease tighten in her stomach. A crude shout followed, laced with a venomous edge, and the blood in her veins ran cold. It was aimed at her, a vulgar jest about her strength, her independence. Her father, ever her fierce protector, had stepped forward, his voice raised in her defense. The scene dissolved into a blur of horrified faces and panicked cries. A foolish prank, they would later call it. Their voices hushed and regretful. A bit of fun. But the heavy cartwheel, dislodged with careless or perhaps malicious intent, had fallen with brutal force. Eliana's heart leapt into her throat as she rushed towards the commotion, finding her father on the ground, his right hand twisted at an unnatural angle, blood blooming against the dusty earth, the white of bone stark against the crimson. The laughter died, replaced by a heavy, guilt-ridden silence. But the damage was irreparable. Her father's forging hand, the hand that guided hers for so many years, was shattered. Infection soon took hold, a creeping fever that left him weak and delirious. Eliana tried to manage the forge alone, her grief and worry a constant crushing weight. But as the days went by, their meager savings dwindled. The villagers, their initial shock giving way to a morbid curiosity and their ingrained prejudice, still refused to buy her work. There was nothing left for them in this place but painful memories and a growing mountain of debt. With heavy hearts, Eliana loaded their few possessions into a rickety cart, her father pale and shaking beside her. They left under a sky the color of hot iron, the silence of their departure a stark contrast to the vibrant life they had once known within the smoky embrace of the forge. The new town was a cacophony of unfamiliar sounds and faces, a chaotic swirl of life that offered a sliver of hope. Eliana's gaze snagged on a crudely painted sign swaying above a soot-stained building. "Blacksmith's assistant wanted," it read. That was it. A chance to use her skills, to provide for her ailing father. She stepped into the dimly lit forge, the familiar scent a small, comforting anchor in this foreign town. A burly man with a thick, grizzled beard and eyes that held a perpetual suspicion looked her up and down. "Good day, sir," Eliana said, her voice steady, though betraying a tremor of hope. "I saw your sign. I'm a blacksmith. Well, I've worked in my father's forge for years. I'm strong, and I learn quickly. The blacksmith scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound. A woman? Are you daft, girl? This is man's work. Get out of here before you hurt yourself. Please, sir, Eliana pleaded, a desperate edge creeping into her voice. Just let me show you I can handle a hammer. I can work the bellows. I know the properties of steel. Just give me a chance to prove myself. My father, he's sick, and I can't afford his medicine. He waved a thick hand dismissively. I need someone strong, someone reliable, not some delicate flower who will faint at the first spark. Now be gone. I haven't got time for your foolishness. The blacksmith's words landed like a physical blow, extinguishing the fragile spark of her hope. That night, the cold seeped into their bones as they huddled beneath the leaky awning, the rumble of unfamiliar carts, their only lullaby. Their stomachs gnawed with hunger, and her father's feverish cough echoed in the oppressive darkness. The infection was worsening, and she had no coin for the medicine he desperately needed. Desperation, cold and sharp, coiled in Eliana's gut. She looked down at the thick braid of her long, black hair, the last tangible link to her mother, a symbol of the woman the world expected her to be. With a heavy sigh that carried the weight of her despair, she pulled out the small shears she always kept for working leather. The sharp snip echoed in the quiet night, a decisive severing of more than just her hair. Uneven strands fell to the damp ground. It was a reckless, terrifying idea, born of necessity and a fierce, unwavering love for her father. But as she stared at her reflection in the dusty window pane, the rough-cropped hair framing a determined, almost boyish face, a new resolve hardened in her. Eliana was gone. Tonight, a boy named Elliot would put on his ailing father's apron and seek a blacksmith's job. And this time, he wouldn't be turned away without a fight. Under the assumed name of Elliot, Eliana navigated the unfamiliar rhythms of Gareth's forge with a constant, low-level hum of anxiety. Every interaction felt like a precarious step on a crumbling ledge, every casual glance a potential precipice. Her father, his fever finally beginning to recede, watched her head to the forge with a weary mixture of concern and grim understanding. He hated the charade, the forced diminishment of her true self, and the sight of her cropped hair, a stark echo of her mother's memory, was a persistent ache in his heart. But he also knew the harsh realities of their world, the societal expectations of a woman. He carried the weight of his injury like a physical burden, blaming himself for the circumstances that had forced Eliana into this precarious disguise. Despite the ever-present fear of discovery, Eliana channeled her worry and frustration into her work. Years of rigorous training under her father had forged her into a skilled smith. She could craft sturdy swords that hummed with a true resonance, fashion intricate armor that moved like a second skin, and weld seams so perfectly they nearly vanished into the metal itself. Gareth, a man whose gruff exterior barely concealed a fundamental fairness, barked orders and kept a watchful eye on his new lad. But even his weathered face occasionally betrayed a flicker of impressed surprise at Elliot's quiet efficiency. One afternoon, while Eliana was meticulously shaping a delicate brace, she overheard Gareth speaking to a customer just outside the forge's open doorway. Aye, a good lad, that Elliot, Gareth's voice rumbled. Never seen a young'un work with such purpose. Strong, too. Shame I can't pay him more, but times are lean. A deeper voice responded, belonging to a man whose boots scuffed against the dusty ground. How old is he then? Looks barely out of his breeches. Not sure, Gareth replied, a shrug evident in his tone. Never asked. 16, maybe. Works like a man twice his age. A pity, the customer mused. Got a niece looking for a decent lad. Seems like a hard worker. Eliana's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as she listened. The casual dismissal of her identity, The reduction of her to a potential suitor for some unknown girl chafed at her spirit. The forge door creaked open, admitting a figure that cast a long shadow across the sooty floor. Eliana glanced up, her grip instinctively tightening on the hammer in her hand. The newcomer was tall and broad, with long, sun-streaked blonde hair half pulled back in a rough knot. His face was weathered, his clothes travel-stained, suggesting a long journey on horseback. He carried an air of quiet authority, a weariness that hinted at burdens carried. "Blacksmith." The blond man's voice was deep and resonant. "I'm looking for the best you've got. The king is recruiting for the war effort. Needs skilled hands to arm his men." Gareth's demeanor shifted, a nervous edge creeping into his gruffness. "The king's service? Well, I'd be honored. But my leg, you see..." He gestured vaguely towards his left leg, a limp that Eliana knew conveniently worsened on market days when haggling for prices. A blatant lie. The blond man's gaze swept over the forge, lingering for a moment on Eliana, his blue eyes sharp and assessing. "I'm not leaving empty-handed. What about him?" Gareth hesitated, a nervous cough escaping his lips. "Him? That's Elliot, my new assistant. Just a lad, green, mostly." The blond man's gaze sharpened, fixing directly on Eliana. "He looks capable enough. Come here, boy." A cold dread washed over Eliana. She forced herself to step forward, her gaze fixed on the worn wooden floor. If he looked too closely... "You're strong, aren't you?" The blond man's voice held a note of command. "Can you forge a decent blade?" Eliana deliberately lowered her voice, trying to deepen its pitch to sound more convincingly male. Yes, sir. I've been working a forge for years." "Good. You're coming with me." A desperate plea rose in Eliana's throat. But my father, I can't just leave him." "The king's business takes precedence," the blond man stated, his tone brooking no argument. "You'll be well looked after." Before Eliana could protest further, a rough hand grasped her arm, pulling her forward. Panic seized her. To reveal her true identity now, in front of this imposing stranger, could mean not only her own death, but likely her father's, and even Gareth's, if accused of harboring her secret. The lie had grown too large, the consequences too dire. She tried to argue, to plead for more time, but her voice lacked the necessary force against his unwavering authority. He simply grunted and gestured towards the open doorway. With a sinking heart, Eliana followed. She found herself jostling in a rough wooden cart, surrounded by a collection of weathered men, their faces etched with the weariness of seasoned laborers. They were all older than her, their hands thick and scarred. Other carts rumbled behind them, filled with younger men, their faces a mixture of fear and forced bravado. Drafted foot soldiers, heading towards the looming shadow of war. The sheer scale of it all, the grim reality of the impending conflict, began to settle upon Eliana like a heavy shroud, a cold knot of fear tightening in her stomach. A stern, commanding voice cut through the air. "Right. You new recruits, line up. Let's get you on the roster. Name and unit." The stern-faced man in military attire was flanked by a scholarly-looking individual with ink-stained fingers, meticulously checking names against a long scroll. They moved methodically toward the blacksmith's cart. "Hold on," the military man said, his gaze settling on Eliana. "That one's too young. Looks barely old enough to shave. He should be with the infantry." The blond man, who had been preoccupied with unbuckling the horses' harnesses, spoke without turning. His voice was calm, but held an unmistakable firmness. "No. He's the smith from Oakhaven. He'll be more useful at the forge." The military man argued with authority. The orders were clear. Every able-bodied man. The blond man finally turned. The effect was immediate. The stern military man paled visibly, his confident demeanor crumbling. The murmuring of the other soldiers ceased. "He's a smith." The blond man's blue eyes, when they finally met the military man's, held a chilling intensity. "He'll work the forge. Is that understood?" Yes, sir," the military man stammered, his gaze darting away. "Perfectly understood. My apologies." He hurried away, calling back to the scholarly man. "Alexander, with me." "Yes, Captain." The man fumbled the list and his quill before scurrying off. Eliana stared at the blond man's broad back, a knot of confusion tightening in her chest. Who was this man? And how could he silence a ranked officer with a single look? Later, huddled around a rough-hewn table in a crowded mess tent, the seasoned soldiers regaled the newcomers with tales of camp life. The enemy, they said, were like shadows on the edge of their vision, always lurking. They'd get close, observe, but rarely engage in direct attacks, just watching, counting their numbers like vultures circling a dying beast. The atmosphere was a strange blend of forced camaraderie and an underlying current of fear. Eliana kept her head down, trying to make herself as inconspicuous as possible, her heart still hammering from the morning's events. This war camp, this new, dangerous reality, felt far removed from the familiar heat of the forge. After days of travel, a welcome order circulated through the camp. Time for bathing. Large canvas tents were erected near the river, and the men hauled buckets of water for a communal wash. Eliana waited until the camp had settled into a low murmur of snores and quiet conversations, hoping to avoid curious gazes. Bucket in hand, she slipped into the dimly lit tent. The only other occupant was the blond man. He was just finishing, a rough towel wrapped low around his waist, his broad back to her. Scars like a roadmap of past battles crisscrossed his skin. Clean, without the grime of travel, he looked less intimidating, almost attractive. He turned, catching her gaze. "Is there a problem, lad?" His voice was softer now. "You're staring." Eliana's cheeks flushed, despite the dim light. No, sir, just needed a wash." A hint of something unreadable flickered in his blue eyes. "My apologies. Didn't mean to intrude on your privacy." He moved past her, the canvas flap rustling. "Life in a war camp is nothing like back home. You'll do good to remember that," he said over his shoulder. "Get some rest. You'll need it." His words, the way his eyes lingered on her, sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool river water. What had he meant? And why did she suddenly feel so exposed? Weeks dissolved into a monotonous rhythm of hammering steel. Eliana, as Elliot, became a fixture in the war camp forge, her skill earning her a grudging respect from the other blacksmiths. She kept her head down, a silent, efficient worker, the fear of discovery a constant shadow. One sweltering afternoon, a gruff sergeant approached her, his face creased with impatience. "Elliot, General's orders. Need these arrows delivered to the war tent immediately." Hauling the heavy cart of arrowheads, Eliana made her way to the war tent, usually a hub of military activity. But today, a hushed intensity hung in the air. High-ranking officers were gathered around a map-strewn table, their voices low and urgent. "What in the blazes?" the general barked, his gaze snapping towards Eliana. "Boy, get out! Can't you see we're in conference?" "Let him stay, General." The blond man's voice cut through the air, calm, yet undeniably authoritative. "Stand behind me, young man." Eliana's heart hammered against her ribs as she maneuvered the cart to stand behind the imposing figure. She was an unwitting witness to secrets, the low murmur of troop movements and battle strategies swirling around her, incomprehensible and terrifying. She focused on the man's broad back, trying to blend into the canvas of the tent. Finally, the meeting dispersed, the officers filing out with curious glances towards the silent boy. Alexander, who Eliana determined was an advisor, wore a mask of tight disapproval. He shot a final pointed look at the blond man before disappearing out of the general's tent. Eliana turned to leave, eager to escape the suffocating tension. "Boy," the man's voice, low and steady, stopped her in her tracks. He hadn't turned. "Stay." The silence in the tent became a palpable thing, pressing down on Eliana. It was just the two of them now. She could feel the weight of his unseen gaze. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost conversational. Elliot, sir," she replied, her voice a shaky imitation of a boy's. "No," he said, a hint of steel entering his tone. "Your real name." Silence stretched between them, taut and fragile. "Do you think I'm stupid?" The question hit Eliana like a physical blow. He knew. The carefully constructed lie, the constant vigilance, all for nothing. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the edges of her vision. I didn't have a choice," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. It started as a small lie, just to earn enough coin for food, for medicine for my father." "Why didn't you say something sooner?" His voice held a note of weary disappointment. "Because..." Her voice broke, rising with desperate urgency. "Because I didn't want people to die because of what I did. If anyone found out, the blacksmith, my father, I'd rather die in battle alone than cause others to suffer for my deception." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with unspoken accusations and raw vulnerability. Eliana stood trembling, bracing herself for the inevitable consequences of her exposed secret. Her fate, and perhaps the fate of others, hung precariously in balance, suspended in the humid air of the war tent. "Your father," his voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, almost thoughtful. "How is he?" Surprised by the unexpected shift in tone, Eliana stammered. I don't know. He was getting better before I left, but without my income, without the medicine." She trailed off, afraid to imagine what could have happened in her absence. A heavy silence settled between them. Then he spoke again, his gaze fixed on the worn canvas of the tent. "What you did, it was foolish, reckless even, but honorable." Eliana's breath hitched in her throat. "I'll keep your secret," he continued, his voice low. "But I can't allow you to stay in the soldiers' tents any longer. If they were to find out, I don't want to think about what they might do." He led her away from the bustling center of the camp, towards a quieter section where fewer tents stood. "You'll stay here. If you need anything, I'll be right there." He gestured to a small, newly erected tent nestled beside his own larger dwelling. That night, under the flickering light of a small oil lamp in the man's tent, they shared a simple meal. Firelight danced across his face, softening the stern lines she'd come to expect. She'd learned his full name was Duncan Valerius, the fourth son of the king. He'd volunteered for this war, seeking a purpose beyond the long shadow of his elder siblings, seventh in the line for the throne with his older brothers already producing heirs. The crown was a distant, unattainable gleam that he had no desire to pursue. He'd hoped to make a difference here, to truly serve his people. Instead, he'd mostly witnessed the brutal, senseless loss of young lives. "Your skill at the forge," Duncan said, his voice tinged with a weariness that mirrored her own. "It's remarkable. How did you come to be so proficient?" Eliana took a breath, the crackle of the small fire the only other sound in the tent. She recounted her story, the early loss of her mother, her father's patient tutelage, the constant dismissive prejudice she'd faced in her own village. Duncan listened intently, his brow furrowed in contemplation. "It's wrong," he finally said, his voice firm. "Utterly wrong that a talent should be stifled by something as arbitrary as gender. I've seen your work, Eliana. You're better than half the smiths in this camp." His words hung in the air. She agreed with him, but she knew words wouldn't change how the world saw her. It was a battle she fought most her life. They finished their meal in silence. Duncan cleared the table and politely offered his hand. "It's late. You should get some rest." "What about you?" Eliana asked, looking at the weariness that had settled over him. "Me?" A wry chuckle escaped his lips. "I'll sleep when I'm dead." Sleep offered Eliana little peace. The weight of her secret, the unexpected kindness of the prince, the ever-present threat of discovery. It all churned within her. The next morning, she sought refuge in the familiar clang of the forge before dawn. Duncan, appearing shortly after, his gaze flicking towards her every so often, a silent acknowledgement, a strange sort of reassurance. It became their unspoken routine. One night, restless and unable to sleep, Eliana had stepped out of her tent, seeking a breath of cool night air, only to stumble upon Duncan, locked in a fierce argument with his advisor. "Don't be a fool, Duncan." Alexander's voice was strained, laced with a desperate fear. "These are the orders. I'm just the messenger." "Ah!" Duncan's frustrated sigh hung in the air. Relief flickered across his face when he saw Eliana. They moved a few paces away from the lingering tension, their voices hushed against the growing chaos. "The clouds, they're so dark," Eliana murmured, gazing at the starless sky. "A storm is brewing," Duncan replied, his gaze also fixed on the ominous darkness. "It feels like the whole war is a looming storm," Eliana said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This waiting, it's unbearable." "We have orders," Duncan stated, his jaw tight, "to hold our position." "Whose orders?" "My father's." Just then, a whooshing sound sliced through the night, followed by the terrifying crackle of fire. A shower of flaming arrows arced across the sky, landing with sickening thuds on the hill overlooking the camp. "Eliana!" Duncan's voice was sharp with urgency. "Head for the river, now!" Eliana didn't hesitate. She turned and ran. Shouts tore through the camp as the men woke for battle. The first wave of arrows rained down, igniting tents, turning the night into a fiery nightmare. Screams erupted around her. She kept running towards the dark line of the river, the only promise of safety. But as she passed the forge, she was hit with a wave of guilt. She veered towards it, grabbing swords, axes, anything that could serve as a weapon, and began thrusting them into the hands of terrified, half-awake soldiers. I'm just a farmer's son," one young man stammered, his voice trembling. "I should be planting seeds with my father." Eliana offered him a sad smile in the flickering firelight. "Me too." Another volley of arrows rained down, closer now, impacting the ground around her. One struck the young soldier in front of her with a sickening thud, and she watched the light leave his eyes. She ducked under a heavy workbench as it was peppered with flaming projectiles. Scrambling out, She grabbed a bucket of water and doused the flames, licking at the fallen soldier's clothes. She may not have known him, but she knew he deserved to be buried, not burned by the enemy's arrows. Rain began to fall, fat, heavy drops that turned the dry earth to mud. The distant clash of steel grew louder, the sounds of true battle joining the fiery chaos. Eliana grabbed the last sword, a couple of daggers that she tucked into her makeshift belt, a bow, and a quiver full of arrows slung over her shoulder. She glanced towards the relative safety of the river, then back towards the raging battle, towards Duncan, and she ran towards the fray. She found him, amidst the chaos, a whirlwind of steel and fury, holding his own against a desperate onslaught. A rider, on a war horse, a heavy mace raised high, charged towards him. Eliana drew an arrow, the snap of the bowstring lost in the din, and it sank into the rider's shoulder. He tumbled from his mount into the muddy ground, where Duncan finished him with brutal efficiency. He looked up, just as lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating his rain-soaked face, his blonde hair plastered to his skin. Fury burned in his blue eyes. He cut down every enemy between them until he reached her. "I told you to leave." His voice was raw with anger. "I couldn't." Eliana's voice was strained. "I couldn't leave you to die." They spun and fought back to back, their movements becoming strangely synchronized in the chaos. Then, through the swirling mud and the flashing steel, Alexander approached, his face contorted with strange urgency. Duncan, you need to see this. The orders. They've been forged." His words were a cruel deception. A dagger, glinting wickedly in the firelight, plunged into Duncan's side. He dropped his sword and crumpled to his knees with a strangled cry. Eliana screamed. Alexander turned to her, drawing Duncan's blade from the mud with a triumphant sneer twisting his features. She raised her sword. "A girl," Alexander laughed, a high, cruel sound that cut through the din of the battle. "I'll make quick work of you." "I am not a girl." Eliana's voice was fierce despite the tremor of fear that ran through her. "I'm a woman." As their steel clashed, Eliana realized that Alexander was surprisingly skilled. His attacks came fast and relentless. He advanced, backing her into a tree. A flick of his blade and she was disarmed. Her sword landed out of reach. He pressed the blade into her chest. The pain was so intense, she let out a whimper. "Maybe I could find use for you." A sickening grin spread across his face. "You couldn't handle me." She grabbed a dagger from her belt, slicing up his forearm, causing him to drop the sword. He lunged to grab her, but she held the blade to his throat, and he froze. "On your knees," she ordered. She pressed the blade. A drop of crimson ran down his neck. He obeyed, his knees squelching in the mud. The sounds of battle around them began to subside. They had won. Soldiers rushed forward, restraining the wounded and furious Alexander. Eliana ran to Duncan, who lay pale and still in the mud. Was he unconscious? Dying? She didn't know. She rolled him onto his back, tearing strips from her rain-soaked tunic, pressing them desperately against the gaping wound. "Medic! Someone get a medic!" Her voice was choked with tears. Duncan's weak hand closed around hers. "Eliana." His voice was a faint whisper. "I'm so tired." "No." Eliana sobbed, her tears mixing with the rain on his face. "Duncan, stay awake, please." A weak smile touched his lips. Then, his hand went limp. Months later, Duncan lay propped in a bed, looking pale but alive. Eliana, her cropped hair now neatly trimmed and growing past her shoulders, stood beside him, wearing a simple flowing dress. She carried a tray laden with food. "Alexander wasn't his real name," she said softly. "It was Alistair, the enemy prince. 6th in line for the throne or something. He'd intercepted the actual advisors sent by the church years ago. At the camp, he intercepted your father's correspondence, ordered the drafting of all the able-bodied boys. He hoped to cripple our forces and weaken the border." Duncan scoffed a laugh. "He almost did." A troubled look shadowed his face. I should have known. I should have demanded to see the orders. Or... "He was vetted by your father and deemed a trusted advisor," Eliana reminded him gently. "You had no reason not to trust him." Duncan grunted, shifting restlessly in bed. "Ugh, when can I get out of this godforsaken bed?" He whined like a child. Eliana laughed softly. "Not until the physician clears you. He's hopeful. Within the month." "And everything else?" Duncan asked, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "How's the camp? How's your father?" "The camp is recovering, and my father is relieved. He's taken quite a liking to the forge here at the castle. Oh, the nobleman approved the bill. Women can now work in male-dominated trades, though not many have signed up yet." "Give it time," Duncan murmured, closing his eyes for a moment. "Anything else?" A soft smile spread across Eliana's face. "The invitations have been sent, and I had my final fitting for the dress." Duncan leaned back against the pillows, a hint of his old teasing spirit returning. "Tell me what it looks like." Eliana shook her head, her dark hair swaying slightly. "Absolutely not. It's bad luck." A shared laugh, quiet and full of promise, filled the room.